Welcome to Something Different, a place where every video is made to capture your attention and leave an impression. If you enjoy content that feels unique and engaging, subscribe and stay with us. The night my fiancé told me our entire relationship had been a bet. We were sitting on the wraparound porch of his family's house in Nantucket. 2 glasses of Blanc de Blancs between us and the Atlantic going dark. 6 months earlier he'd proposed to me on that same porch, at sunset, with a ring I later learned cost more than my car. I'd said yes while the water turned gold. Now the sky was the same color, and his voice carried the same careful warmth it always had, and he told me, almost gently, that the whole things had started as a dare. $75,000, he said. Split between him and 2 of his friends from the investor group that backed our firm. The bet was simple. He couldn't get the new girl, me, the one Cressida had personally recruited from Boston, to fall for him, present his biggest client pitch under his direction, and agree to marry him within 14 months. He'd won with 3 weeks to spare. I want to tell you, I screamed. I want to tell you I threw the champagne, or at least said something sharp enough to cut through the sound of the surf. But I didn't. I sat very still and watched him. And what surprised me most wasn't the cruelty of it. It was how relieved he looked. Like he'd been carrying something so long. His shoulders had forgotten how to sit straight without it. You weren't a random target, he said. He wanted me to know that. You were the obvious choice. Smart enough to make the work look real. Ambitious enough not to question why doors were opening. And just lonely enough to believe it. Just lonely enough. I turned that phrase over for a long time afterward. The drive to the ferry to the mainland, the train back to Chicago. 12 hours between that porch and my apartment, and I spent every one of them not crying, which surprised me too. I sat in the dining car with bad coffee and a notepad and I wrote, in very small, very careful letters, what do I actually know how to do? By the time I got home I had a list. I should back up. I came to Aldrich and Hart Design Group, 18 months before that night in Nantucket. 32 years old, 7 years of portfolio work in residential interiors and commercial renovation. 1 failed long-term relationship behind me. And a reputation in Boston's design community that was growing faster than my paycheck. When Cressida Hart called me personally. Not through a recruiter, not through LinkedIn, but on my actual cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon. I thought someone was pulling a prank. Cressida was, at that point, the most respected name in high-end commercial design in the Midwest. Aldrich and Hart had built half of Chicago's most photographed hotel lobbies, 3 museum expansions, and a riverfront development that had been featured in every architecture journal worth reading. I had a framed printout of one of their projects on my office wall in Boston. I'm not embarrassed to admit that. She told me she'd seen my renovation of the Callaway building in Cambridge. Said the way I'd handled the atrium. The light management. The balance between historical preservation and functional modernity. Was the most intelligent interior decision she'd seen in a debut commercial project in years. She wanted me in Chicago. She wanted me on the Harrington Tower interior design team, the firm's biggest contracted project in a decade. I said yes before she finished the sentence. My first morning at Aldrich and Hart. I wore the blazer I'd bought for my Boston interview 2 years earlier, and carried a portfolio I'd spent the weekend reorganizing. The office was on the 14th floor of a West Loop building. All glass and white oak, and the quiet kind of money that doesn't need to announce itself. Marla from the drafting team met me at the elevators and walked me around, and I was so busy absorbing everything. The project walls, the materials library, the scale models along the East Corridor, that I nearly walked into the man coming out of the corner conference room. His name was Gavin Mercer, head of business development. He had the easy smile of someone who had always been the most comfortable person in every room he'd entered, and he extended his hand and said, "You must be Cressida's new recruit," in a tone that managed to be both a welcome and a subtle reminder of the hierarchy. Cressida recruited a lot of people, he said. Not everyone lasted. I plan to, I told him. He smiled, like it was the most charming thing anyone had said all week. What followed was, I understand now, a performance. But at the time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. A friendship that shaded slowly into something more, mentorship that became dinner. Dinner that became the kind of arrangement where you stop counting whose apartment you're waking up in. Gavin was attentive in the specific way of someone who has studied what attentiveness looks like. He remembered small things. A comment I'd made weeks earlier about a building in Barcelona. The exact coffee order I'd given once to a barista, and never repeated. He showed up at my desk with the coffee anyway. He came to my presentations not as my supervisor but as someone who looked proud, visibly, in a way the rest of the room noticed. I noticed Cressida watching us sometimes. She never said anything. I thought it was professional discretion. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. The Harrington Tower pitch was the inflection point. The client, a development group out of Dallas, had very specific ideas about what they wanted, and very little patience for anything that didn't meet those ideas precisely. The interior package needed to thread a needle between the building's brutalist bones and a modern hospitality concept that would appeal to the kind of tenants who could afford the rent. Gavin brought me in as lead designer on his team. He was the face of the presentation. I was, in his words, the genius behind the curtain, which I took as a compliment. I worked 6 weeks straight, most nights past 10. My apartment during that period was a place I visited between design sessions. I built the concept from scratch, the material palettes, the spatial logic, the lighting philosophy that became the project's signature. Every decision was mine. Gavin presented it. He stood in front of the Dallas clients in a suit that cost more than a month of my salary, and talked about our vision and our approach. And the room leaned toward him, the way rooms lean toward men, who sound like they know what they're doing. We got the contract. The firm celebrated. Gavin took me to dinner and ordered a bottle of wine I knew was $300, and told me I was the most talented person he'd ever worked with. And I believed him. And 3 months later he proposed on a porch in Nantucket as the sun went down. After he told me, I made one stop before I got on the ferry. I called a lawyer. Not because I had a plan yet, but because I needed someone to tell me what my options were. And because I refused to walk back into that firm without understanding exactly what had happened to me. And what, legally, it meant. She told me what I'd suspected. Orchestrating a professional situation to extract work product. Using a romantic relationship to prevent someone from asserting credit. Structuring a financial bet on those outcomes. It was worth looking at very carefully. We scheduled a follow-up for the following week. I didn't go to the office the day after I got back. I spent it at my drafting table at home, pulling every file I had, every design note, every email, every version history that proved what I'd built and when. 7 years of professional habit. I backed up everything, dated everything, kept every iteration. Turned out to be the most important thing about me that Gavin had failed to account for. Monday, I went in. The thing about walking back into a room where people expect you to be destroyed is that the expectation itself becomes a resource. Every person at Aldrich and Hart that morning was waiting to see which version of me would come through the door. I could feel it. The eyes that slid sideways, the conversations that paused just slightly too long. I went directly to Cressida's office. She looked up from her desk and she did not look surprised. "Close the door," she said. I told her everything. I told her about the bet, the amount, the names. I watched her expression, which did not change the way I expected. She didn't look shocked. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for a specific bill to come due, and was relieved, in some grim way, that it finally had. She told me what I hadn't known. This wasn't the first time Gavin had done something like this. There had been another woman, 4 years before I'd joined. A project manager. The firm had managed the situation quietly. The way firms manage things when the person causing harm has powerful friends, and the person being harmed doesn't yet know how to be loud about it. "I recruited you because of your work," Cressida said, "and I am ashamed it took this long to make this right." She offered me the Harrington Tower project, not as Gavin's lead designer, as the architect of record. My name on the contract, my name on the presentations. The work that was already mine becoming publicly, formally, undeniably mine. I said yes. The weeks that followed were the hardest I'd ever worked. And the most awake I had ever felt. Harrington's clients had to be rebriefed. There were careful conversations, a meeting where I sat across a conference table from the Dallas group and laid out, very calmly, the design rationale behind every decision in the package. Within 20 minutes, one of the clients asked me to walk him through the lobby concept again, because he wanted to record it. Afterward, he emailed Cressida directly. Why wasn't she presenting from the beginning? Gavin was still at the firm. His position hadn't changed. Not yet, but the texture of his days had. The clients who'd known him as the creative face of Harrington were being introduced to a different face. The investor group, that included his friends Reeve and Pax, was being reviewed by the board, following a legal filing that had nothing directly to do with me. But that had been triggered by documentation I'd handed to my attorney. I didn't orchestrate that. I just made sure the truth was findable. He would pass me in the hallway and say nothing. Once I caught him in the elevator, and he looked at the floor for 11 floors straight. Marla told me his lunches had gotten very quiet. I didn't let myself enjoy that. I had too much work to do. Finn Keating came into my life the way useful things often do. Sideways, without announcement. He was the structural engineer on a new project we'd picked up 3 months into my new role. The renovation of a historic warehouse in River North that a hospitality group wanted to convert into a boutique hotel. He came to the first design coordination meeting, with a coffee in each hand, gave one to me without explanation, and then proceeded to ask the most precise set of structural questions I'd encountered in a professional setting in years. He was not my boss, not a client, not someone whose opinion of me determined anything about my position in that room. He was a peer who happened to be excellent at his job, and who, I noticed slowly and then all at once, paid attention when I spoke in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. We didn't rush anything. We worked together on the River North project for 4 months before we had a dinner that wasn't a working dinner. I told him about Gavin on the 3rd date. Plainly, the way you describe weather. Here is what happened. Here is how I handled it. Here is where I am now. He listened without trying to fix it or perform outrage on my behalf. You seem like someone who already dealt with it, he said. I'm still dealing with it, I told him, but yes. He nodded. Like that was the most reasonable thing I could have said. 9 months after I walked back into Aldrich and Hart, the firm went through a structural review. 3 of the investor seats on the board were reclassified, including the ones held by Reeve and Pax, whose arrangement with Gavin had come to light in a way that made their continued positions untenable. Gavin's entire division was absorbed into a new structure under the firm's senior partner team. Under me, specifically. He came to my office the afternoon. The restructure was announced. He stood in the doorway the way you stand when you've been building up to something for a long time and have finally run out of road to delay on. I know this was fair, he said. I want you to know I know that. I looked at him for a moment. He was still handsome, still well-dressed, still someone who would always seem comfortable in a room full of powerful people. None of that had changed. What had changed was that he was standing in my doorway and the nameplate beside it said my name. I appreciate that, I said. Your quarterly accounts are due Friday. He nodded and left. 1 year to the day after that night on the Nantucket porch, I stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Architecture and Design Awards ceremony. My dress was the same shade of blue as the one I'd been wearing when Gavin told me the truth, which was not an accident. Harrington Tower had taken the top prize in commercial interior design. My name was on the award. My name was in the press release. There was a photograph of me in the elevator on the way up that morning that Marla had taken on her phone. And she'd sent it to me at midnight with 3 words. Look what you did. I scanned the room before I began speaking. Professional habit. I always check my audience before a presentation. Gavin was seated near the back. He'd come as part of the firm's general delegation, which his new role required. He was watching the stage with an expression I recognized, but couldn't quite name. Not quite regret, not quite admiration. Something in between that might have just been the look of a person watching a door close, that they'd been the one to shut. I thought about the list I'd written on the train back from Massachusetts. What do I actually know how to do? 7 items. I'd done all of them. I didn't plan a speech, I told the room. which was mostly true. But I've been thinking about what it means to do work that's actually yours. To have your name on something you built, not performed, not positioned, just built, from the ground up because you knew how. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when something lands as true. A year ago someone told me my ambition was a liability, that wanting to be excellent made me easy to use. I paused. I've thought about that a lot, and I think the mistake wasn't mine. The applause started before I finished the sentence. Gavin left Aldrich and Hart 8 months after the restructure. He took a position at a smaller firm in Phoenix, a lateral move that anyone who knew the industry would recognize for what it was. I heard it from Marla on a Thursday. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter. The specific relief of a problem that has finally resolved in the direction of the truth. Cressida made me a named partner the following spring, Aldrich and Hart and my name, on the glass by the elevators, on the letterhead, on the contract for the River North Hotel, which opened to a Tribune review that called the interiors the most thoughtful integration of historical structure and contemporary hospitality design the city has seen in a decade. Finn came to the opening night. He stood next to me while the hospitality group's CEO gave a toast, and at some point he put his hand at the small of my back. Not to claim anything, just because it was where his hand wanted to be. And I thought about the cashmere sweater, and the porch, and the champagne and all the things I'd believed that turned out not to be true. And then I thought about the train ride, the bad coffee, the list. Some bets tell you exactly what you're worth to someone who means you harm. The useful thing, the thing Gavin never accounted for, is that knowing your precise market value to someone like that is the clearest possible signal to build something worth so much more. I raised my glass, and the room filled with light, and my name was on the door, and I had put it there myself,